Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Allegations of war crimes are being levied at Russia after a horrible scene of dead civilian bodies in the streets, executions, and mass graves have been reported at the Ukrainian city of Bucha, not far from Kiev. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling on the United Nations to remove Russia from the UN Security Council, which would require two-thirds of the General Assembly to approve of. Zelensky also criticized the United Nations for its inability to fulfill its own charter to maintain international peace and security. Today we're going to be in conversation about war crimes. What are they? Who determines who has committed them? And when do international institutions succeed? And when do they fail at holding war criminals accountable? My guest for this conversation is Rebecca Gordon. Rebecca Gordon teaches at the University of San Francisco. She is the author of the book Mainstreaming Torture American Nuremberg, the U.S. Officials Who Should Stand Trial for Post-9/11 War Crimes. And currently she's working on a new book about the history of torture in the United States. It's a forthcoming book, but when it comes out, it should be called The House That Torture Built. She's also a regular contributor to TomDispatch.com. Professor Gordon, always good to see you. I thank you dearly for taking this time to talk to me today.
Delighted to be here, Mitch. Thank you for inviting me.
I find Volodymyr Zelensky's call yesterday to remove Russia from the UN Security Council to be very interesting. There are 5 members who are permanent members of the UN Security Council that can basically stop the United Nations from doing anything meaningful. I guess it could do symbolic things without the Security Council, but really meaningful things, you need the Security Council. These 5 members are able to veto a lot of meaningful potential actions. It includes Russia, but we should also be clear, it also includes the United States. And what's happening in Ukraine right now, neither you or I are in Ukraine. I do want to say this. So oftentimes when we see something like this happen, this may be exactly what's happening, but our understanding of what has happened becomes clearer with time. There's always this fog of war. So Russia denies it. We should point that out as well. Still, both Russia and the United States have a long history of protecting themselves by using this position in the UN Security Council and also protecting their closest allies from potential scrutiny concerning war crimes.
That's absolutely right. And I think it might be helpful to listeners to know how these 5 countries, which are the United States, the UK, France, Russia, and China, got on the Security Council in the first place as permanent members. And the answer is that this was established with the Charter of the United Nations when the UN was created in the aftermath of World War II, so in 1948. And 4 of those 5 members had been the major allies against Germany during World War II. It was then the Soviet Union, not Russia. China was added as obviously another large power. And actually, for a long time, it wasn't China, it was Taiwan. But that has, when China was admitted to the UN, one of its prices was that it would be the representative, not Taiwan, which they consider to be merely a part of China. So these are the 5 permanent members. And you're absolutely right that the United States could very easily have been accused of and tried, members of the government tried for war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so yes, I think that the problem with removing Russia from the Security Council, the only reason the UN worked really for so many years is that they were able to have this balance. If they had excluded the Soviet Union at the time of the formation of the UN, it probably wouldn't have been able to do many of the things that it has been able to do in terms of creating peacekeeping in other parts of the world and basically allowing a balance of power to continue. I'm not saying one way or the other what I think the UN should do now. Clearly, we have seen that not only Russia, but the United States is able to completely bowl over the Security Council when it's necessary. So, for example, when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, the Bush administration had promised the Security Council they would not go in without a resolution from the Security Council approving the invasion. But in the end, they were unable to get that. And so they went in anyway. So the U.S. also has a history of violating Security Council resolutions.
Would that have been a war crime?
Well, that's an interesting question. And so let's talk about our understanding, modern understanding of war crimes comes out of the tradition that was established at the Nuremberg tribunals. So these were the trials that were held in Germany after World War II to hold not individual soldiers so much as what they call in Latin America, the intellectual authors, the people at the top of the government who were responsible for the policies that led to these crimes. So there were three major categories for which people were tried in Nuremberg: the crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The first and the third were new categories that had never existed in international law before. The central category, war crimes, are violations of the laws and customs of war. And so, believe it or not, there are a lot of laws of war, and there are a lot of treaties that have created those laws. And the most famous, of course, are the Geneva Conventions, which govern how both combatants and civilians, and also members of the press and medical staff, are to be treated during war. But the first crime, the crime against peace, was something the U.S. actually argued for, because their argument was that by invading other countries, by invading Poland, that Germany had in fact violated a 1928 treaty called the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, which basically outlawed war as a solution to international problems. And the US and Germany were both signatories. And what the argument the US was making at Nuremberg was all the other crimes sprung from this aggressive war that was made by Germany without provocation. I would argue, as many have, that the United States in invading Iraq in 2003 was guilty of exactly the same crime. And there are a lot of crimes the U.S. committed in the second category, war crimes, that came as a result of that unprovoked invasion. So yes, I would say it was a war crime.
Is that unresolved, though, in the United Nations? Is it not clear that it's a war crime? I mean, I hear that you're saying the United States argued that it should be back at the forming of the United Nations in the early years here. But is that something that had been codified or written out?
There is an Article 51 in the Charter of the United Nations, which essentially says it's illegal for members of the United Nations to make aggressive war. The only legal war is a defensive war when you are attacked on your own territory. The United States made a really indefensible argument that, well, this is really, our attacking Iraq is really a defensive action because they're they're building these weapons of mass destruction that they're going to use on us someday. But essentially, this is illegal under the UN Charter. For sure.
I hope I'm not nitpicking here. Is there a difference between a being illegal and a war crime under UN Charter? Right.
So that's Article 51. The war crimes are actually governed under other set of agreements between countries, that mostly the Geneva Conventions, especially the ones that were signed in 1949 after World War II. And these are the things that govern prohibitions of murder, attacks on civilians, torture, using people for medical experimentation, and they govern the treatment of people who have been captured. They make it illegal, for example, to deport people civilians or who've been captured, or to put them to work as slave labor. They govern especially the distinction between civilian and military targets, all of which have been called into question in the behavior of Russia as it's been reported in Ukraine. So yeah, those are the war crimes. And the UN, unless it creates a special tribunal of some kind, doesn't have the power to try anybody, to put anyone on trial for those things. So in the case of the former Yugoslavia, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Yugoslavia dissolved, and there were terrible internal wars, the UN created a tribunal called the Tribunal for war crimes committed in the wars in the former Yugoslavia. It lasted for 27 years. I mean, it lasted a really long time, or 17 years. And it, in the end, a few people were actually convicted, and the trials were actually held at The Hague, which is also the location of the International Criminal Court. So one thing the UN can do, and this is something Zelensky also asked the UN to do, is establish a tribunal, the way that they did in the case of the former Yugoslavia for the crimes that are being committed in Ukraine. So that's an action the UN can take. The other place where people get tried for war crimes or in crimes against humanity is in the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court is the descendant of the Nuremberg Tribunal. That what they envisioned was this tribunal in Germany would become the model for an ongoing international tribunal that would exist institutionally. It wasn't until 1984 that the countries that came together to create this International Criminal Court were able to ratify a statute called the Rome Statute that created the ICC. The United States signed that initial pact, but it was never ratified by the Senate. And in 2002, so a year after the September 11th attacks, at the start of the so-called global war on terror, Donald Rumsfeld and the Bush administration wrote to the ICC and said that they were withdrawing their signature and that the U.S. had no intention to ratify.
So that happened after 9/11.
Yes. Yes. And the reason why is that they did not want to see any U.S. personnel in any way hauled in front of an international tribunal for things that they already knew were going on, like torture. And so the U.S. has never ratified it. We are not part of the ICC. And in fact, Congress passed a law that some of us called the Invade the Hague law, that said that not only could the United States not in any way participate in any trial of American personnel for crimes committed in Iraq or Afghanistan, but that if any U.S. persons were actually put on trial, it would be up to the United States Armed Forces to liberate them by any means necessary. So obviously this never came to pass. But interestingly, when Donald Trump was president, the woman who was the then chief prosecutor at the ICC wanted to prosecute people for torture, people who had committed torture in Afghanistan, of Afghan citizens, wanted to put those people on trial because even though the United States is not a member of the ICC, Afghanistan is. And so she was coming to the United States to interview people to start the process of such a prosecution, and the Trump administration pulled her visa, and she was never able to come. So that is still hanging fire and will probably never happen.
How about Russia? Did Russia sign on to the International Criminal Court?
They did originally, but like the United States only a few years later, they also withdrew their signature, and that was after the Russian invasion of Crimea. So at this point, they are not a member of the ICC. It should be pointed out that there's a lot of criticism of the International Criminal Court because the only people who have ever actually been put on trial there are from Africa. And the statute is essentially designed to try people who, for whatever reason, cannot be tried in their own countries by their own people.
What about the former Yugoslavia? Was it not the ICC?
No, that was a special tribunal that was created by the United Nations. It's a different entity. And that's what Volodymyr Zelensky is asking the UN to do, is to establish a tribunal. So not as the ICC, but as the United Nations.
Okay, so that's an important distinction to understand here, that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is not under the purview of the United Nations?
No, it was created by a treaty that a large number of countries signed, but it is not under the purview of the United Nations. And it is not the same thing as the World Court, which people sometimes confuse. The World Court is a place where countries can sue each other. The ICC is designed to try individuals for criminal acts.
But the World Court wouldn't take up something like
they would
war
not.
crimes,
However, during the Contra War in Nicaragua, Nicaragua went to the World Court and sued the United States for mining its harbors on the two coasts of Nicaragua, which, by the way, mining harbors is a war crime. And the World Court found in Nicaragua's favor and granted a fine of $5 million, which the U.S., of course, never paid.
So going back to Nuremberg, was this something that was created by the United Nations?
No, the World Court was also
No. I'm sorry. No. Nuremberg. Forgive me.
Oh,
yeah,
no,
Nuremberg.
Because the UN didn't exist. The UN was created after the Nuremberg trials. And so this was something that was created by the four powers who were the allies. So the major combatants in World War II, the US, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. They came together, and in fact, there was a lot of wrangling, and there was a charter or a treaty called the London Charter that the four countries agreed to, that set out like what the roles would be of different members of the people playing, who would be the prosecutors, who would be the judges, and what would the crimes be. And all of this was discussed and wrangled among the four victors in World War II. And that's how that was established.
So it sounds like in order to try war criminals, you have to have the agreement from the most powerful nations in the world, who are not the losers in the conflict in which the war crimes are connected to.
That's exactly right. And this is why very often you hear the accusation that trials of war crimes are victor's justice, right? And in fact, the people who established Nuremberg, some of the American folks, including Robert Jackson, who was one of the prosecutors, pointed out that we should remember that the standard to which we're going to hold the high Nazi officials is the same standard that we ourselves will be judged by. And there were people who were part of Nuremberg who envisioned the idea that there would also be tribunals for actions that had been committed by the Allies that also constituted war crimes, not crimes against peace, but definitely war crimes. Among them, the most famous probably for Americans, because it happened in Europe and not in Asia, is the firebombing of Dresden, which was essentially an attack on the civilians of the city of Dresden, which burned the city. However, what's less well known is that there were 60 cities in Japan, most of which were buildings of wooden construction with a lot of paper walls inside the buildings that just went up like crazy. 60 of those cities were burned by the United States from the air. Many more people died in those attacks even than at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Rebecca Gordon about war crimes. Rebecca Gordon teaches at the University of San Francisco. She is the author of such books as Mainstreaming Torture American Nuremberg, the U.S. officials who should stand for trial for post-9/11 war crimes. Her forthcoming book is called The House That Torture Built. We've been talking around it, but maybe we should talk directly about what technically is a war crime.
A war crime is a violation of the laws and customs of war. So the customs of war have existed going back to medieval times, and they have their basis in European just war theory. And the idea is there are certain things you don't do either before you start a war, you don't do certain things during the war, and you don't do certain things after the war. And the things you don't do in the middle of a war concern protecting civilians, really making a distinction between who's a civilian and who's a legitimate military target, what installations, what buildings are civilian targets, what buildings are military targets. And it involves also how you treat anybody who is a combatant in the war. And this includes people who've been wounded. So, for example, the whole way the Geneva Convention started was way back in 1859 when there was a war between France and Sardinia, and on one side and Austria on another side. It was being fought in Italian territory. And there was a terrible battle, and 9,000 people were left injured on a battlefield. And both armies just disappeared and left these wounded people there. And there was this Swiss tourist who happened to be in Italy who came upon this battlefield and was horrified. His name was Henry Durand. And he actually organized a local church and managed to get these people treated. He eventually went back to Switzerland, which is why the Geneva Conventions started in Geneva, and created the International Committee of the Red Cross, and was responsible for creating the first agreements among nations about how, and initially it started out how people who were injured on the battlefield would be treated. And that's why international law about war has this really strange name. It's called international humanitarian law, because it has to do with the humane treatment of the wounded and prisoners of war. So these are the things that are war crimes. So in the case of, for example, the things that Russia is accused of doing in Ukraine, that would include attacks on hospitals, attacks on schools, attacks on apartment buildings. It would include the execution of civilians. It would include certain kinds of weaponry is also considered a war. Use of certain kinds of weaponry is also considered a war crime. So after World War I, the nations that are part of the Geneva Conventions agreed no more use of chemical weapons like mustard gas. And it's pretty much generally recognized, although not by nuclear armed countries, that the use of nuclear weapons would also be a violation of the laws of war. And in both cases, this is partly because you can't really control the effects of weapons like that, because it depends on which way the wind is blowing. And, there are people who argue, for example, that even the use of depleted uranium should be a war crime. Depleted uranium it's uranium that has mostly lost its radioactivity, but not entirely. It's a very, very heavy element. So it's used in shells to penetrate tanks. And the U.S. has used it a lot in Iraq, both in the first Gulf War and in the second Gulf War. And the argument is that radiation persists, and there will be generations of, and we've seen this in Iraq, people born with disabilities and also cancers that are the result of exposure to this. So war crimes include weapons that shouldn't be used, and cluster bombs are another one that the U.S. has used and has refused to give up. But one of the accusations against Russia that we're hearing from the Ukrainian side is that they're using cluster bombs. And the problem with cluster bombs is that they are one great bomb that has tiny little bomblets inside, and they're oftentimes the size and shape of a can of soda. And the problem with them is, one, they're indiscriminate because they go all over the place. But two, the ones that don't explode persist, and they can be set off days, months, or years later by a child, for example, picking up something that looks like a can of soda. So, yeah.
When the United Nations was coming up with this legal system around war crimes, did it just not include a way to enforce them or to have accountability for violating them?
Well, it was brand new, right? And they did not. What they have over the years evolved is the capacity. See, the UN doesn't have an army. And it was created, there was a lot of discussion at the time of the formation of the UN, whether it should be like a quasi-state or a super state that actually had an army. And the decision was made largely by the people who, the large countries that formed it, that the UN would not have policing power. The military power that the UN has is to ask its member nations to contribute troops for peacekeeping. So in situations where some kind of truce or some kind of delicate situation exists, where having the presence of troops to keep two sides separate, for example, is where we see the UN peacekeeping troops involved. But these are not troops that are under the command of the United Nations, and they are not UN troops. They are troops of individual countries that are lent to the UN for peacekeeping purposes.
I keep thinking about Professor John Mearsheimer, who has gotten a lot of attention during this war. Controversially, some of the things he said has been received as controversy, but basically, his argument is Ukraine would have been better off to make a deal with Russia, put aside NATO ambitions. And he didn't say this is because it's right or wrong, morally right or wrong, but he said this is just the way of the world. I'm paraphrasing him. He'd say it much more elegantly than I will. But, this is just the way of the world, that power rules. You can have all your legal international systems, but when it comes to the powerful, they don't really matter.
Realpolitik. Yeah. Well, of course, this is exactly the approach that successive U.S. administrations have also taken. They haven't perhaps articulated it except in their private councils. But yeah, that is the alternative. There's a wonderful book called The Internationalists, which is a history of the Kellogg-Briand Treaty and how and why it came about that changes in international law exist so that it would be possible to outlaw war. And what the authors argue is that in the past, it was illegal actually to use economic sanctions against other countries. Those were considered an act of war. And in fact, they were considered a legitimate reason for another country to go to war if they had been subject to embargoes or trade limitations of various kinds. These things were considered, and this comes out of the whole Adam Smith idea that free trade is the sine qua non of wealth, of the wealth of nations. So their argument is that, and of course, this was before the war in Ukraine, but their argument is that the existence of economic sanctions has made it possible without military power to actually constrain the actions of nations that would otherwise have committed, aggression and wars. And they have argued strongly for that. I think we are yet to see whether or not the use of such powerful sanctions against Russia is going to cause, Russia to leave Ukraine. I doubt it. Whether or not the Ukrainians should have fought back, whether or not they made a tactical or strategic error, in a sense, I feel like that's not for me to say. Mm-hmm. One of the other principles of the United Nations is the idea of self-determination of peoples, right? And I think you can argue that it was a tactical error not to give in to Russia. You can also argue that giving in to Russia would have been a form of appeasement that would have only made Russia hungry for more. we don't ever get to find out what would have happened.
Yeah.
We only see what is happening. I mean, when the war started, I thought that probably the way out that would give Putin cover would be for Ukraine to cede the Donbass, the part that has been, fighting since 2014, where there's been some internal fighting.
And people say war crimes are happening there as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's complicated. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. That maybe if they were to cede that to Russia, that would allow Putin the face-saving ability to withdraw and declare a victory and get out. But I'm not going to argue against civilians in Kyiv who decide that they're going to defend their city because they don't understand Realpolitik.
Yeah. And just the impunity of it. The fact that and I guess there hasn't been complete impunity for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They have been hit with very hard sanctions. They're still continuing to be hit with hard sanctions, even financially in a new sort of way things are happening, which is pretty remarkable. And I could be behind something like that if a country was to invade a sovereign nation that wasn't under immediate a threat. That, yeah, maybe that's the correct way. Maybe that is a way you could stop war, is to have the world respond and to sort of economically cripple that country. But just like how these international criminal courts, just how the UN responds, it's not going to be used equally. It's unimaginable to see something like that happen to the United States, whether in 2003 or even any time in the future.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think that in the case of Russia, Europe has a really big problem, which is they've allowed themselves to become dependent on Russian natural gas to heat their homes. And up till now, so today there's an agreement to boycott Russian coal. The next step is going to be petroleum, and the final step is going to be natural gas. And they want to do this in stages so that they have something in reserve. But the truth is that if we really are going to apply sanctions, just as we sacrifice, as countries expect people, civilians, to make sacrifices during wartime, we will be asked to make sacrifices in terms of paying higher amounts for hydrocarbon. Now, some people hope that this might push the nations of the world into a faster transition to non-carbon producing fuels, but I'm not holding my breath.
Rebecca Gordon has joined us for a conversation about war crimes. She teaches at the University of San Francisco. She's the author of such books as Mainstreaming Torture American Nuremberg, and her forthcoming book is called The House That Torture Built. Rebecca Gordon, I thank you.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you, Mitch.